All right, where are we at? Uh-oh, we ain't nowhere. There we are. Ha. Okay. I even got the date right today. I'm on the ball. Okay. I talked a little bit about signs, and of course, there's another account of signs back in Matthew 12, I think, Matthew 12, Matthew 11, where basically the same thing happens, and Jesus responds in the same way, but a little more detailed. He says, "No sign to be given except the sign of Jonah, that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth." Here, Jesus doesn't elaborate on that sign particularly. He's already done that earlier. But he does say, the sign will be Jonah. And he left them and he went away. But he also says, there's a lot of signs that you don't see. He says, in the morning there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. And do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the time? Fair weather. When it is evening, it said be fair weather, for the sky is red. So it's, Mark says, they were beginning to argue him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him, and sighing deeply in his spirit. He says, why do this generation seek for a sign? So, they're wanting to trick him. They're wanting to catch him in this. He says the signs are all around you. In Mark, he says no sign will be given to this generation. In Matthew, he says, except the sign of Jonah. So a little bit different discourse there. But basically, he's saying, the signs are here. It's the right time. We know that from the prophecy of Daniel, the birth, other things that I've done, miracles that you've seen, signs that you've seen, and yet you can't discern it because you want something more. Well, what they wanted, he could not give them because it wasn't why he was here. That's basically what it came down to. The sign that they really wanted to see, he could not do, because the sign they really wanted to see was for him to rise up and be a king. And that sign was something that was not going to happen. So, he says, you're evil and adulterous, seeking for a sign. And the only sign will be the sign of Jonah. And I think the sign of Jonah prophecy is really interesting, and I don't want to get off on that but too much, but I preached a sermon a while back on how I really think Easter week went instead of how we always think it goes, in the tomb on Friday, out on Sunday morning. And because I really think that philosophy of time, which really is very Catholic, the idea that he went into the tomb on Friday, and then came out on Sunday morning, that really doesn't fulfill the prophecy of Jonah. And that's one problem with that idea. Of course, they always say, well, you take Jewish time, any part of a day is a day. That's always an argument I heard from the time I was a child. So if he went in the tomb on Friday, that would be a day. And then Saturday was a day. Then if he didn't get up, leave the tomb till after daylight on Sunday morning, that would be a day, and that would be 3 days. But you can't get 3 nights out of that. So it really doesn't fulfill that prophecy. And so I think that's wrong, basically. I think it was a high Sabbath, and he went into the tomb. And actually, that high Sabbath was on a Wednesday. So if you take that philosophy, then he was in the tomb a full 3 days and a full 3 nights, and the prophecy of Jonah was fulfilled. So I really think I think once again, traditionally, we take a lot of things in religion traditionally, and we don't question that, and maybe and I think sometimes we need to. Traditions are powerful, but you got to remember, most religious holidays that we think about, Easter, Christmas, Lent, those holidays that are like religious holidays, Ash Wednesday, Palm Sunday, that's very Catholic. I mean, the Catholic Church is who instituted most of those holidays. Christmas was Christ's Mass, right? So it was, all that really came out of Catholicism, and it's one of those things through history, through tradition we've maintained, but sometimes we have to go back and look at that a little bit closer. So it's kind of interesting to me. The leaven of the Pharisees. They came to the other side. He says, beware, watch out, really, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Do we not bring any bread? Jesus says, why do you discuss the fact you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Why do you discuss among yourselves you have no bread? You know, their thought was always physical, wasn't it? When he wanted to feed the multitudes, what do we have? Well, how much money do we need? When he talks about the leaven, once again, their response is physical. Do we not bring enough bread? Jesus is wanting them to get past that. He's wanting their response to be a spiritual response, not a physical response. And it's the same way with us. We're very physical people. When things happen, we think, well, what can I do about that? What can I change? Instead of thinking, maybe I should pray about that. Maybe I should see what God has to say about that. They didn't look to Jesus. They always looked to themselves, didn't they? They always looked to themselves. We didn't bring any bread. How can we get enough money to feed all these people? What can we do about it? They always look to themselves, and we do the same thing. We look to ourselves instead of looking to God, and it's the same thing that's happening here. He was trying to tell them of their teaching, not food. Beware of the teaching of the Sadducees and Pharisees. And we spoke a little bit about those different sects of the Jews. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees were the most prominent sects of Jews at the time of Jesus. And both of them he criticized for their teachings, for their heart, for what they did, how they acted. And once again, it was because they looked at the outward appearance, what they were, what they looked like, and what they acted like, instead of what was in their heart, what motivated them. Jesus has always been more concerned, whether it's them or us, about our motivation, not so much our action as our motivation. What's motivating us to do it? What's motivating us to do the things that we do? Is it God? Is it ourselves? Is it our own desires, our own lusts, our own wants, or is it the desires of God? What's our motivation? And once again, the leaven, Jesus uses leaven all the time in the Bible. The idea of leaven, that leavens everything, and we know that from bread. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. A little bit of bad teaching can influence a whole lot of people. Beware of that. Beware of false teaching, of people who don't teach what God would have them to teach. He says, don't you remember these feedings? Don't you remember the 7 and the 7 loaves and the 4,000? Don't you remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000? And he says, how many did you pick up? They said 12. And he said, how many did you pick up? And they said 7. Isn't that interesting, those numbers? How many baskets were left over? Exactly biblical numbers that mean something, right? It wasn't random. They didn't get 3 baskets. That would have been kind of a bad thing. Or 6 baskets, did they? They got 12. 12 is such a biblical number. Isn't that astounding? You know, 12 is 12 apostles, 12 tribes of Israel. You know, when we look at Revelation, a perfect number, 144,000. 12 times 12 times 1,000, right? So perfect numbers. And then once again, then how many did you get? 7. 7. Biblically complete number is 7, right? A number of completeness is 7 in the Bible. Over and over in Revelation, I think 48 times in the book of Revelations, the number 7 is used because it's a complete number. This was no random thing. How many baskets? 12. Well, that's a perfect Jewish number. How many baskets? 7. See what Jesus is saying? Why does he ask him that question? How many did you get? 12. That's a perfect number in Judaism. That's a complete number. How many did you get? 7. That's a complete number, right, in Judaism. And he's trying to say, don't you see? It wasn't an accident. I not only fed him, I had the exact amount left over that was a complete number, right? It was perfect. Don't you remember? It was perfect. See? Not just what I did, but what was left. Everything was perfect. And he said, don't you remember that? Don't you think I could feed you if I needed to feed you? Why are you worried about bread? I'm not talking about bread. I'm talking about talking about the leaven, the teaching of them. He says, he was saying, do you not yet understand? It says, and in Matthew, he explains it. He says, beware of the leaven, they do not understand, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Influence. That's what this is about, influence, right? What influences our thinking, our mindset, or what we think is acceptable or not acceptable? What's our influence in life, right? Me and Susie was actually talking about this last night with television. Boy, what a terrible influence, really, television is in our lives, isn't it? I mean, we invite that right into our home, and it's pretty bad, isn't it, anymore? I mean, really. You know, things that influence us, what we feed on, right? What our mind feeds on. Those things affect us, don't they? Any comments? Yeah, I don't know. I guess they kept them and ate them. I don't know. I guess that was a midnight snack. I don't have a clue. They ate all they wanted, didn't they? There was plenty. More than enough, right? More than enough. I'll never forget the first time we had Thanksgiving dinner on Thanksgiving, the first year we did that. And I thought we made a lot of food, but boy, that first time we did that, there were about 200 people here or something like that. And I kept thinking, there's no way we're going to feed all these people. And I kept thinking of the loaves and the fishes, and I thought, well, Lord, you need to make this stretch. And we fed everybody. I never forget that. We fed everybody. I didn't think we'd ever make it. I thought there's no way we got enough food, but we fed everybody. So God provides enough, more than enough. Bible says He can bless us abundantly, right? More than we can imagine, and that's true. God can take care of us. This is a really interesting healing right here. Very unique in the Bible and very full of teaching. You know, like I said, we don't have all Jesus' miracles. We have a very, very few of Jesus' miracles, I'm sure. But this is a very unique miracle. It was a time that Jesus didn't heal somebody completely the first time. That never hardly happens in Scripture, does it? You know, Jesus' miracles are always complete and instantaneous and whole, right? But this was a teaching moment for them. And it's interesting, he's following this up. So keep the context in your head. We just started talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teaching of them, right? The teaching of them. And then immediately after this, we're going to go into this healing of this blind man. Very interesting healing. It's been Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. So he brought him out of the village, and you got to really understand the significance of this. So when Jesus takes him out, it doesn't just mean that why didn't he do it there in front of everybody, right? Why didn't he do it? Because a lot of times Jesus' miracles were very public, right in front of everybody. But this time, this was a teaching miracle. This had nothing to do with the blind man, okay? Nothing to do with the blind man. The blind man was just a tool that Jesus used to teach his apostles a lesson. And so he takes them out with his apostles. So it's not everybody, because he's wanting them to see this. He's wanting them to understand this. He just got done telling them, beware of the teaching of these Sadducees and Pharisees, right? He just got done saying that, teaching them that. So he takes them out here, and it's one of these cases where he spits, right? He spits on his eyes. Doesn't say that he made clay like he did before and put it on there, right? He just takes the guy and spits in his eyes. I think that's kind of an interesting thing, right? And he just spits in his eyes. And so, you know, Jesus healed in so many different ways, didn't he? If you remember, he makes the saliva in the dirt, and he puts it on the man's eyes born blind from birth. Sometimes he healed from a distance. Every miracle had purpose. Every miracle had teaching. Every miracle was according to God's will. And I think that's like if you look at Jesus' first miracle, turning the water into wine, that might have been one miracle that Jesus did that might not have been a God will miracle. I think he might have just did that for his mother. Because what did he tell her? He said, my time's not yet come, right? In other words, I'm really not ready to do miracles. But, you know, mothers, you know, since it's for you, Mom, I'll do it. Right? I mean, that's always kind of how I looked at that miracle, right? Because I'll do it for you. But anyway, back to the story. So he does this, and it's one of those times that he does it, and then he says, do you see anything? right? So he never says that in any other miracle. He never asks that question because he knows, right? He knows that they can see. But in this time, he says, do you see anything? And he said, I see them like trees walking around. In other words, I can see, but I can't, right? In other words, they're just like trees walking around. They're not. My vision's not clear. I can't see clearly, right? And so Jesus says, and again, he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored and began to see everything clearly. And he says, don't even enter village. Jesus had just told him, beware of the teaching of the Sadducees and Pharisees. And Jesus repeatedly told him, though you have eyes, you don't see. Though you have ears, you don't hear. Right? Jesus is saying you can see things and not see it right. You can see things and see it wrong. Your point of view isn't always right in life. How you see it isn't always how God intends for you to see it. You need to look intently. Look at what the passage says. He looked intently. Do you see that? In other words, you can't just glance over a teaching or glance over and say, oh, well, that's what it means. That's what it is. You have to look intently at it. I think, how do you take that where it says that? He laid his hands on his eyes and he looked intently. Who looked intently, do you think? Jesus or the blind man? Yeah, Keith says a blind man, right? You know, it's interesting. Translators agree with you. How do we know that? How do you know translators think that wasn't Christ that looked intently? Because of the capitalization on the H, right? Translators agree with you because any time in the Bible that he refers to God or he refers to Christ or he refers to the Holy Spirit, it's always capitalized. So the very fact that they don't capitalize the H on the he means translators agree with Keith that it wasn't Jesus that looked intently, it was the blind man who looked intently. You see the lesson? You have to look intently. See? You have to look intently. He looked intently and he was restored. When he looked hard at it, when he really looked, he was restored. Jesus just said, watch the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? And Jesus just illustrated his point. He says you have to look intently at what's going on in order to be restored. You can't just glance at it. Wow, I think it's a really powerful miracle. Are there any comments about it? I think because, well, several times Jesus said that, but I think in this case it was because this was really a private miracle. You know, I don't know if that really makes sense, but it's almost like I just did this for them guys. And I just think Jesus, repeatedly he would tell people that. Don't go, don't tell anybody. Of course, they always did. I mean, how could you not, right? But I just think it was because it was private. He took him out. I think it was just for the apostles, and he's just like, go home. Don't. This isn't about anybody else. This really isn't about you. This is about these guys and me trying to teach them something. It's not to proclaim who I am. It's not to be a sign. If you remember right, he just told them, I'm not going to give you any signs, right? You know, and I think he just said, so just go home. And I think there's power in that because Jesus was trying to say, I don't need miracles to attest to who I am. I'm not doing miracles so I can be popular. You know, that's not the purpose of my miracles, is so that I can be popular. The purpose of my miracles is to teach, to prove that I'm the Son of God, to do these things, but it's not about popularity. So, I don't know, you could read a lot of different things, but I don't know, I always felt like this was just a really private miracle, really a teaching miracle that was really unique. You know, it's just for them guys, just to teach them something that he wanted to illustrate. But then again, what a teachable moment for us, too, to look intently at things, not just to glance, but to be intent, to know what we're looking at, to look past tradition and to look past what man would say and to look at what God says. So I don't know. Best answer I have. Best answer I have. Okay, Herod. Boy, I always think the Herods are so confusing in the Bible, and I always try to kind of talk about that when we start talking about the Herods, because you kind of, I think, so let's talk about the Herods for a minute, because I think in the Bible, in the New Testament, it gets kind of confusing. So Herod the Great, he was Herod when Jesus was born, right? He's Herod, the Herod that the wise men went to. That was Herod the Great. And Herod the Great got that whole region. I mean, it's a huge region. Idumea, Galilee, Samaria, Judea, that whole area. Big region. And he got that because of the Caesars, right? Because he went to Rome. He basically said, you know, if I can make this rebellious bunch of people that are the Jews and all these Semitic speakers that are such a big bunch of trouble, which they still are today, right? He says, if I can make them toe the line, make me a king. So Caesar basically said, all right, you know, it works for me. So he did, you know. But in 4 BC, Herod dies. 4 BC. We know that because there was an eclipse of the sun in 4 BC, and Herod died in the year there was an eclipse of the sun, and that's the only thing that matches up. So Herod died in 4 BC, which means Jesus had to have been born about 6 to 4 BC, before Herod died. So Herod had a bunch of kids, right? Herod tried to kill Jesus when Jesus was a baby. That did not work out for him. Herod had a lot of wives, okay? A pile of them. But these are the ones that mattered. And of those wives, there were 3 men born who we call the tetrarchs. And when Herod died, all of Herod's lands got divided up into these 3 sons. Philip, okay, was one. Philip the tetrarch, by Cleopatra, who was not the Cleopatra you think of, not the Cleopatra of Egypt, okay? That was one son, and Philip got Idumea and all that land up in the north. Philip was disposed by the Caesars in about 4, I believe it was about 4 AD. So Philip didn't have a very long span in there before he was basically just taken out of office by the Caesars, and that became a Roman provinces at that time, okay? And then you had 2 other guys. You had Herod Antipas, okay? And Herod Antipas is the one that we really read about mostly in the New Testament. Herod Antipas was the one who was, at the time of Christ, he was the king of Galilee. He was over the region of Galilee and Samaria, okay? And he's the one we generally talk about because Jesus was Galilean. So Jesus was under his jurisdiction. So when Jesus was taken before Pilate, and Pilate said, I'm going to send him to Herod, okay? That was Herod Antipas. And the reason he sent him to Herod was because Herod Antipas was in Jerusalem for the Passover. But he was the king of Galilee. So Jesus was Galilean. So Herod had authority over Jesus because Jesus was Galilean. That's the reason he sent him to Herod, and then Herod sent him back to Pilate. Because at the time of Jesus, the area of Judea had been taken away from the Herod that was the tetrarch there and had been made a Roman province. And it was ruled by Roman governors. So at the time of the crucifixion, Judea was ruled by a Roman governor, and y'all know who that was, Pontius Pilate, okay? He was actually the ruler of Judea at the time of Christ. There wasn't a king of Judea at the time of Christ. That had been taken away. Now, the other Herod we really look at is, and of course, remember John the Baptist being beheaded, that's because Herodias was married to Herod Philip, not Philip the Tetrarch, but Herod Philip. And she left Herod Philip and married Herod Antipas. But the daughter of Herod Philip and Herodias was Salome. She's the one who danced, right? Who danced before who? Herod Antipas. And he said, I will give you whatever you wish. And she said, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Okay? Herod Antipas would be disposed by the Caesars in about 39 A.D. In other words, he would be relieved of his position, and that area would become a Roman province, like Judea and everything else. Herod Antipas went to Gaul with Herodias in Salome, and would wind up going to Spain. Interesting fact I did not know until Debbie brought it to my attention, and I actually researched it and looked it up. And according to Josephus, Salome, who had danced for the head of John the Baptist, Salome was crossing a frozen lake in Spain when the ice broke and fell through, and the ice severed her head, interestingly enough. Interesting fact, right? Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And so that is Herodias. Now, the other one we're going to look at, the other one that comes into play now, who would have been the king over Judea, is Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I would have been king over Judea. He had Peter imprisoned, okay, but also he executed James, at which point he was eaten by worms and he died, and there was not another king placed in over Judea, and that became a Roman province, okay? So that's kind of how the Herods are kind of a confusing bunch. But that's how that works out. And if you look at it, Drusilla, which is the daughter of Agrippa I, is the one in Acts with Felix that came to hear Paul, right? And Drusilla would actually be killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, right? Pompeii. She actually be killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, what we look at as Pompeii. Yeah, go ahead. They never give that because, see, they weren't really like kings. In other words, it wasn't like, you know, my kids are going to get a rule. Basically, when Herod died, he put it in place that the three sons he had would rule in his stead. He arranged that with the Caesars. That's the reason they got that, but not by birth. Now, originally, Herod Archelaus was supposed to have ruled, but Herod Archelaus tried to kill Herod the Great, so he cut him out of his will. Right? So Herod Archelaus was supposed to be one of them, but he tried to kill him. He tried to kill Herod, so Herod cut him out of the will, basically, made him where he wouldn't be a ruler. So because they weren't kings by birth, in other words, it wasn't like a king of England thing, it wasn't like a royal lineage, once their sons came in, the Caesars basically just took that area back and put Roman governors in place and made it part of Rome. The main reason Herod the Great was put in place was because the Romans couldn't subdue this part of the region of the world. They were unruly. The Jews were terrible, you know. They couldn't get them to get in line, you know. So they couldn't subdue it. So that's the reason they made that bargain with Herod the Great. Basically Herod, if you can subdue it, we'll make you king. And he did. So they did. But then eventually, like I said, since it wasn't like a royal lineage, he arranged for his sons to take over the three areas of his realm, basically divided it by three, the tetrarchs. And then basically, once they were disposed, that was the end of Herod's influence in the New Testament or in the country, right? Basically. It all came under Roman governors at that time. So, yeah. Yes, alone. Yeah, by ice, apparently. Didn't know that, actually, till this week. Yeah, cut her head off, yeah. Yeah, the ice. Apparently, she fell through the ice, and it went up to her neck, and I guess the edges of the ice, according to Josephus, the edges of the ice came in and severed her head. So, and they thought that was providence of God, because she had beheaded John the Baptist. So, Yeah, yeah. So that's how all the Herods kind of intermingle. You hear a lot, but in Christ, in Jesus' time, when we talk about Herod, we're talking about Herod Antipas. Okay, that's who we're really talking about. It's Herod Antipas. That's who we're talking about. Until you get to Acts, and then we're talking about Herod Agrippa the first. So that's kind of how that works out. If that helps a little bit, maybe. Interesting. So Herod the Tetrarch, which is what we call him because there were three, tetra, right? Of course, by the time of this, two of them were already been disposed, basically, but we still call him Herod the Tetrarch. Heard the news about Jesus. King Herod, John the Baptist risen from the dead. He was perplexed. John arisen, Elijah had appeared, others that one of the prophets of old had risen again. You know, if you really look at Jesus, when Jesus' crucifixion, and Pilate sent him to Herod, and Herod wanted to see him because he had never seen him, right? If you really look at that account. So even though Herod is king of Galilee, until the crucifixion, Herod never met Jesus, apparently. And he wanted to see him because he thought he would perform some miracle. So he's just hearing what's coming in. Who's this Jesus? Well, it's John the Baptist resurrected, or it's Elijah, or it's one of the prophets. We see that in Matthew where Jesus asked Peter, asked the apostles, who do people say that I am? And so this is John the Baptist risen from the dead. That would be kind of scary for Herod, wouldn't it? Because Herod had his head cut off. You understand what I'm saying? So, I mean, for people to be saying, oh, John the Baptist risen from the dead. Ooh, right? This doesn't bode well for me at all, So that'd be a little scary. He is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. He kept saying, John, whom I beheaded, is risen. So he was a little bit paranoid, right, about the whole thing. Bit paranoid. It says, who is this man whom I hear such things? And he kept trying to see him, right? So when he had the opportunity, when Jesus was in custody before the crucifixion, and he had the opportunity to see him, he was all about that. Yeah, he wanted to see Jesus. That was a big thing for him. And of course, Jesus didn't give him nothing, right? But he wanted to see him. It was a big thing. And that's when we get into Matthew 16, this tremendous discourse. Boy, what a passage. Questioning his disciples. See, he's leading right into it, isn't he? Who do people say that I am? The question he asks. Who do people say that I am? John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets, one of the prophets of old has risen again. Matthew's my favorite gospel in this particular passage. Matthew's my go-to gospel, Matthew 16. Who do people say? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. But then he asks a question, Matthew 16:15. Who do you say that I am? See why I like Matthew? See why it's so important to look at all three Gospels when you look at the stories? I like Matthew here. Matthew gives us, the others are pretty just like, Peter said, you're the Christ. Peter answered, the Christ of God. But it's Matthew. Matthew is who really gets it. Matthew says, you're the Christ. And I love, if you really look at these three Gospels right here, so much different in Matthew. The Son of the living God, he says in Matthew. And he says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Why does he say that to him? Because Jesus would never tell him, would he? He would never tell him, I'm the Christ, I'm the Messiah. Jesus never told him that. He always said, so who do you say then? What's been revealed to you? What do you see in me? that you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed are you. And I love how Simon, son of John. That's what that means, Bar Jonah, right? Simon, son of John. Blessed are you. And Simon, the terminology. So much lesson in when Jesus calls him Simon. So much affection in that, in the Simon, the Aramaic Simon, right? Peter, he says, when he's angry with him, right? But when he's affectionate, Simon, Simon, son of Bar-Jonah. I just think it's such a tremendous passage. And he says, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, my Father who is in heaven. And you are Peter. Interesting, the change in language. Peter and rock, right? If y'all have ever heard that argument. Catholicism start their papal lineage with Peter. Papal lineage starts with, it's actually not lineage, it's, I can't remember that word. Anyway, the start of the Pope in Catholicism starts with this passage. Peter, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The word Peter means rock, right? The word Peter means rock. Petros, small rock, pebble. And upon this rock, Petra, boulder, big rock. Right? So what was the church built on? Peter? Is Peter the rock of the church? Christ being the cornerstone. Yeah, in the Greek, it makes more sense than in the English. Well, you are Petros, you are Peter, small rock, pebble. Upon this rock, Petra, I will build my church, and the gate of Hades shall not prevail against it. But the Catholics take the rock that the church was built on not to be Christ or the confession of Christ, which I believe it's the confession of Christ. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. I believe that's the rock the church is built on, is Jesus Christ, that you're the Son of the living God. Catholics say the rock of the church was Peter. Now, there's a lot in this passage in Catholicism because they take papal lineage to go from Peter. They follow the papal lineage all the way from Peter. So they believe that Peter was the rock the church was built upon. Now look at the rest of the passage. He says, upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind shall be bound, and whatever you loose shall be loosed. So if Peter's the first pope and the church is built upon Peter, then Peter has authority to bind and loose. Right? And the Catholic Church believes today that a pope in cathedra, right? In cathedra, ex cathedra, in cathedra, has the ability to say what he wants to say, to bind it. In other words, if the Pope wants to, in cathedra, if the Pope wants to say homosexuality is okay, then he can basically change the view of the Catholic Church. He can basically say, okay, well, that's how it's going to be. Or now we're going to have women popes. He could say that in cathedra. He could basically loose and bind by what he says. Gives the authority of the Pope, not an authority to the church, instead of authority in the Scripture, authority of Christ. So it's a really big passage in Catholicism. But he does say to Peter, I give you the keys. What you bind will be bound, and what you loose shall be loosed. So how do we take that to mean? What does that mean? What does Peter have the ability to do? And do the other apostles have the ability to do it? Or is it uniquely just to Peter? Right? And what does it mean, do you think? What does that mean for Peter? Keys are what in the Bible? Keys are a symbol of what? Knowledge. More importantly, though, if I give you the keys to my house, I give you the what? I give you the what to my house? I give you permission, authority to enter, right? In other words, I'm giving you authority to do it. You have the authority to go into my house, the authority to lock my house. I'm giving you authority. Keys in the Bible always mean that you have rule or authority over something. So how does that apply to Peter? Let's look at that part of it first before we look at the next part of it. How does that apply to Peter? We're out of time, aren't we? We're out of time. We got to do this next week. Yeah. Okay. We're way out of time. I'm really sorry. I get going. I don't even look. You got to throw something at me or something. Book, I don't know.